conversations. I can have a sidebar with myself this way.
Often feel like I am, so.
Okay, so I'm gonna kick off this meeting right here, right now. My name is Glenn Blackman, and I'm with the Washington Department of Commerce State Energy Office, and we're here to talk about fuel mix. There's basically two chunks of this meeting. One is where Greg Nothstein is going to update everybody on the status of the fuel mix calculations and the model that was developed for that. And then I will take the second half. We're going to begin our legislative stakeholder work, agency request legislation 2018. So with that, I think maybe some introductions would be in order, and I'm going to have Greg go second.
Okay, I'm Greg Nothstein, part of the Energy Office in the Department of Commerce.
Go ahead, Isaac.
Yeah, Isaac Gaston, Benton, Franklin, PUD.
Rose Feliciano, Seattle City Light.
Karen Cargill, City of Seattle, Office of Intergovernmental Relations.
David Nightingale, Washington Utilities and Transportation Commission.
Rick Applegate, Tacoma Power.
Ian Hunter, Snohomish PUD.
Michelle Patterson, Mason, PUD 3.
Kent Lopez, Washington Electric Cooperatives.
I'm Dave Arpaugh here for Chelan and Snohomish PUDs as well as the City of Richland.
Marion Daca, I'm with Tacoma Public Utilities Government Affairs. Diana Carlin here on behalf of Cowlitz PUD, US PUD,
Alex Miller with Cowlitz PUD.
Okay, I think we should stop there because otherwise we just circle again. Do we want to,
People on the phone?
let's, the little shortcut on that is we've got Todd Jones from the Center for Resource Solutions, Tyler King, Clallam PUD, Mary Winkie from Pacificor, Debbie Winnie, Zach Yanez from Snohomish. Yeah, there are 35 people. I'm not, let's see.
Just scroll on the far right. If you move the whole thing over.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, there we go. Look at that. Zach's the last one on the list. I wonder why that is. Alexei Kalambokidis from Grant PUD. Andrew Warren, Blake Weathers, Buddy Stanovich, Robert Davis, Frederick Burke, Janine Pratt, GPD. What's GPD? Okay, well,
Greg
we'll skip
Paul Douglas.
Stephen Granville, Greg King, Beverly Aikida, Joel Meyer, John Francisco, Johnny Bosch, Kathleen Collins, Cheryl Kettner, John Lyons, Melissa Lyons, Matt Samuelson, Sean McKee, Mike McDermott, Marie Morrison, Paul Dietz, Power Auction, Rebecca Smith, Sandra Bazilio, Sanjay Kapoor, Teresa Smith, Teresa Hampton. Anybody didn't get wants to identify themselves? Okay, well, then I would encourage, in fact, I think maybe, encourage everybody to mute
your phones.
We'll leave it open here in case somebody needs to do a question, but otherwise, please keep your phone on mute. And Greg, take it away.
All right, so I will talk a little bit about the 2015 fuel mix report. We'll touch on software updates, status of the report, the detailed report that you're all expecting, and then the 2016 fuel mix cycle.
So can I just ask a clarification? So is what you're putting up, we got a, Carol Lee sent out a PowerPoint. It's not, is that in the same order than what you're showing?
I believe it is.
Okay, because, okay.
It's on slide 4 right now.
Okay. So mine don't have numbers on them.
Little tiny numbers at the bottom.
Oh, okay, I see they're buried underneath the comments.
Okay, so since the February report, there have been some changes. We discovered that the BPA residual resources were not being put back into the net system mix, so now that is done. It's not done in the software, it's done by tricking it. The generation and claims adjustment features, especially the generation adjustment features, were not working properly. Now they are. There are a couple generation and claim adjustments that came in late. Those have been made. There's a proper categorization of the Pacific Core adjustment calculation. And now that's put in the right place in the software.
Hey, Greg, this is Mary from Pacificor. Is there a way you could provide us, we don't necessarily need to spend time here talking about that, but is there a way you could provide us more detail about what that means specifically?
Yeah, do you want me to do that offline with you?
That's fine, yeah.
All right.
But I just wanted to be able to have a look at that.
Yeah.
Hey, Greg, I would expand on that question and ask that if it affects the calculation in that system, it's everyone might want to hear the explanation, but if it doesn't, sidebar conversation is fine.
It affects it a little bit. So if y'all want to talk about that now, about a little bit.
Well, why don't we, so I know that speaking with Sandra earlier, we had a question about the zeroing out, you mentioned the things, and so I don't know if zeroing out is in the same bucket as the proper categorization of claims from Pacificor, but I know
it's a different step, but
our folks wanted a little bit better explanation on the zeroing out.
well, it's what's been done historically, and I just trued it up to what was done before. It was the right resources were not being pulled out.
I think that my folks weren't really clear about exactly what the mechanics of zeroing out meant, so.
Well, it means the leftover wind, solar, and geothermal in the net system mix is zeroed out.
It's not counted as part of the net system mix.
It's not counted as net system mix. So that's been the policy for quite a few years. It's been in the previous reports.
And so the way I think about it is that we take a particular project, say a wind project, and we have information on its total generation, and then we have claims that different utilities have made, and if those add up to less than the total generation for non-renewable resources, the remainder would go into the net system mix, but for renewables, we don't put that remainder in. Our working assumption is that we have missing claims rather than unclaimed renewable generation. Does that sound
And
like?
that's an assumption that we have challenged, and we're still not comfortable with it, just for the record. We are still very uncomfortable with that assumption.
And we're always open to data. You know, if we saw a definitive accounting of the output of any particular wind project, and we could really rule out the possibility that some of its output was not being claimed by any utility, then I think we, apart from, if there might be, kind of complexities in doing the math that if it weren't a big effect, we might skip over it. But in general, on principle, we would be happy with it going into the mix if we know for sure that nobody's making a claim for it and for a voluntary purpose or a regulatory purpose.
I guess our concern is that you're using two different sets of assumptions based on the source. You are making that assumption for non-renewables, but you're making another assumption for renewables, and we don't see the justification for that. There is none, as far as we can figure out, that we're very uncomfortable with that discrimination that you're making. It's just doesn't make sense to us.
Do we know how much of a difference it makes or has made?
It's about 21 million megawatt hours.
So there's 21 million megawatt hours of apparently renewable resource.
Yeah, as with our narrow look at claims in the Northwest Power Pool, so if you expand claims to Pacificor and other utilities that are outside of it, that 21 million becomes smaller.
And what percentage is 21
Of the Northwest Power Pool. Northwest Power Pool is about 300 million, so it's a little over 300, so it's about 15, 6-some%.
So it's not insignificant.
Right.
Okay,
Well,
so,
Did you say 21 million megawatt hours?
That's what I said.
Okay. So that's a couple thousand average megawatts. Just checking.
Could express it that way.
okay, so and I know you've explained this to me before, but I'm a simple girl, and I need to be spoon-fed. Okay, so I got 100 megawatts of wind, okay? 50 megawatts, utilities have purchased the wind and the RECs, okay? So Seattle City Light bought 50 megawatts, so we served our customers with those 50 megawatts, and we kept the REC, and we retired the REC for added bonus. So then there's 25 megawatts where utilities just purchased the REC. And that 25 megawatts of wind got sold to who knows who. They just kind of went to the thing and just got picked up wherever. And then there's 25 megawatts that was sold on the market that still had its REC. So what happens? Where's that in this unclaimed? How's that 100? How do you deal with that 100 megawatts?
Well, the last 25 would be part of the market, the way you've defined it.
So
But you zero it out, right?
So that 25 is zeroed out?
Only if it's unclaimed.
Well, only if it's unclaimed, but you've made the assumption that it is part of the market.
So just out of curiosity for the people who are actually doing this stuff, if you're buying wind and it has a REC, are you keeping the REC? I mean, I'm just trying to figure out, like, how's the REC not, like, it seems like everybody would want the REC. Like, that's why you're buying the wind, because it's got a REC, right?
You know, I think we might get into the REC discussion later on.
But isn't that part of the zeroing out? No?
It touches it.
I think in the scenario you just gave, if 25 megawatts wasn't claimed by anyone as special and it was just sold somehow, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
but not to anyone in a specified manner, this process would zero out that 25. So it wouldn't show up as, oh, there's 25 megawatts of wind in the Nexus Index. That wouldn't show up. That would, and then the other 75 with current practices would.
That's all accounted for this, for you, and you.
And what I think they are assuming is that there's no way you're going to have 25 megawatts of wind with RECs that wouldn't get used by something, right? Because in your scenario, you're assuming nobody's using those RECs for anything, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the assumption is that
That helps. Thank you.
all those renewables are being used to be RPS as voluntary or specific industrial purchases, whether they want wind. So it's all spoken for.
Hey, Greg, real quick, a question on that, though, that kind of complicates it, at least in my mind. So for your scenario, right, if like you're talking about 25 megawatts, let's say you zero that out because I don't claim it, I bought the power, I got the REC, but I'm going to sit on that REC because I'm not going to retire it this year, I'm going to retire it next year for next year's fuel mix. But then your assumption is you zeroed out the wind for this year, but I'm going to come back and I'm going to use those RECs next year. What would you do then? How does that?
Well, yeah, that's a challenge of fuel mix, the vintage of the REC.
But in a fashion, because they zeroed it out already, it doesn't really matter.
It doesn't matter.
No one else.
Yeah, so then when they take it the next year, we haven't double counted because of that.
So this is Melissa on the phone, and if we didn't allow the RECs to count, then you wouldn't have that issue. You would report just based on source. But a benefit of not having the RECs modify the fuel mix reporting, just having the sources reported, would mean that you wouldn't have this mismatch between years where, depending on when you use the REC.
Yes.
Well, that was helpful, thank you.
Okay.
Because it's like kind of walking through, so you still have your REC, but you're not using it, and then it's zeroed out, but that doesn't really matter because it's been zeroed out, and it's all good. I got it, mostly.
Yeah. Dave Nightingale, I'm just wondering what's the driver for not just accounting for energy generated and used as opposed to worrying about the RECs? I mean,
That's the question we have because our reading of the law at all. It's just where was it generated and who used it?
if it's generated, it's going to get used somewhere, regardless of the source of generation. It's going to end up in the system being used somewhere. So I'm just wondering, I just don't know what drivers for the policy as it exists today, I guess. Yeah.
Well, the RECs embody the environmental attributes of the generation, and so those can be separated from the energy. And to make a claim on a resource without having the RECs, we think would be misleading. It would be inconsistent with good disclosure practices to make claims that you're delivering a renewable resource to a customer when you don't have the attributes of that resource. And so we need to watch out for things that may have been produced by a renewable energy generating facility, but in fact don't have their renewable attributes anymore. And so to guard against that misleading disclosure, we don't include renewables where we can't make a good, can't say with confidence that the attributes are with that energy.
Yeah, see, and that's the concern.
This is Mary at PacifiCorp again. I just wanted to comment a little bit on that, partly based on our experience in California. You know, what the FTC guidelines say is that you can't make an unqualified claim. So, you know, if you're claiming that if you're identifying a source and you clearly state that the RECs aren't necessarily attached to that energy, that can be consistent with the FTC. What we've proposed in California is actually separating the reporting and reporting the source of the energy and reporting the RECs separately, but you're reporting them both. So you are attempting to not be misleading by reporting them separately. I just kind of wanted to put that out there as an option that might be kind of further in the discussion. But for a number of reasons, it becomes very challenging to report RECs and energy together.
And this is Melissa Etcheland. I want to add too that this isn't just a renewable issue. This is actually an issue for even hydro things too, especially as the specified source selling into California continues. You're not making any adjustments for that. So you're basically making only adjustments for what's claimed and then versus EIA data. And there's a whole bunch of stuff that happens in between that's contractually bound that's totally missed.
And I think the way we look at this, as full requirements customers, to go along the line that you were talking about, your reasonings for doing this, is actually more misleading. Because if somebody is looking at the fuel mix disclosure report for a co-op, okay, and they see, oh, there's, no wind purchased by my co-op. Well, maybe there was. It was in the fuel mix. I mean, in the net system mix. And they purchased some wind. But because you guys don't want to count it, because you're assuming that it wasn't in the net system mix, that's misleading. This whole business about RECs or not is information for the purchasers of power. The guys at the end of the line don't understand that. The people who are looking that up on my co-op's website don't understand that. They just want to know where the power came from, which is how the law was. Where does the power come from? Not or what its attributes or how dirty or clean is it. None of that is assumed by this legislation. It's not there. What they want to know is where did the power come from? And so what your manipulation of this data in our eyes is more misleading than what you're trying to avoid.
I just want to make sure that we're clear on one point here, which is that the idea that we don't want to count the wind that's not the case. In fact, we do want to count the wind, and we would always prefer more claims for the resources that we've seen now. And we're in a discussion here about what to do with the kind of the sloppy stuff that's left over once people have declared everything that they have, and how are we going to deal with all these unknown resources. And the smaller we can make that pie, everybody's going to be, especially us. And so it's not that we don't want to count the wind, it's that we don't want to count the wind twice. We don't want to have it showing up in the net system mix when somebody out there has actually sold the right to make the claim to a corporate customer somewhere else, or they've used it for compliance in a different state. We don't know where it might be, but we don't want to make the wind twice.
Okay, well, that goes back to my point that this is a fuel source. Where did the energy come from? Not what are its attributes.
Yeah, I understand that point.
Yeah.
And for instance, for the 2015 disclosure, the wind that you're having us with our utility report, we actually used in 14, and I know you've identified that that's part of the one of the problems, but I think it's very misleading.
And when you say used, you mean used for RPS compliance?
Or
Well,
delivered.
we actually used that was retired in 14.
Well, the REC retirement.
Yeah.
So used for RPS compliance is REC retirement.
Well, let me rephrase that. It was their 2014 vintage.
Okay.
Used in 15.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
So we actually used that power in 14,
yeah.
but because of the reporting mechanism in place, we're having to report that on our 15 fuel, which isn't correct.
Okay.
It's not apples to apples.
It just seems to me like you need to have two sets of books.
And that's going.
You need to have one set of
what
books that's
he's
the
saying
power delivered
is
and
that it needs to be
and then
the,
you need another
the
set of books for your
resource.
racks. I think that's,
What about Mary's idea of reporting the RECs separately? That seemed like maybe it would be a good path forward, or at least something we should explore. I don't know, Mary, if you can provide more detail on exactly, are you already doing that reporting to California?
No, we have proposed it in California. California has an open rulemaking right now, kind of dealing with some of these similar issues. But, one thing that I would comment on is that, we already keep separate books. Our sort of the energy delivery information is separate from the RECs that we use for compliance. And in Oregon, for example, we have a bank of RECs out to 2028. So RECs generated today we may not use for many years. And so it again, I think we've been having this conversation around trying not to be misleading, but, and it kind of goes to what is the purpose of the disclosure? And I think our view is that, it can be too confusing for people, but it's important to communicate both the source of the energy, the physical source of the energy, and the renewable attributes in order to, separately, in order to avoid being misleading. Because, I think it's equally misleading to, report a REC as if it's energy, because it's not. It's an environmental attribute. So I think it's a challenging thing, but I definitely think that it's worthwhile looking at sort of having separate disclosures for energy and RECs.
Comment on the phone.
Okay.
Go.
But hi, doesn't the REC entitle me to claim that that's my fuel? It includes all the non-energy benefits, including the fuel type. So if I'm retiring a REC for my customers to serve my load, I'm saying I served it with the wind associated with that REC that I'm retiring.
Correct. And that's how we've treated RECs in the fuel mix disclosure process in Washington. And
And I'm not disputing that, but what I'm saying is that the physical reality of what occurred is different. That REC didn't, produce electricity for you in reality.
Well,
and that's the tension there.
at the same time.
But I think the fuel mix is asking me to identify where my fuel came from, and if I have a claim on a REC, that lets me claim that the fuel came from wherever that REC was generated from.
And I think if we're trying to distinguish physical realities from the ecologies that the power market puts on top of the physical reality, we're going to need an army of electrical engineers in here rather than accountants. Because,
I'm not talking about power, trying to figure out one resource, where resources go. I'm just saying that, that it becomes complicated when you're trying to attach RECs to brown energy and say now it's green, in terms of this fuel mix disclosure to customers and trying not to be misleading.
Yeah, and we certainly have a path that we could report on that would be more detailed than what we currently report on, but wouldn't be to an engineering level, power flows and all that. So I think there is an in-between there, which is the contract path, which is what you see California do for a lot of their reporting.
And I'm, one more comment too. I mean, we do PacifiCorp, we have a fuel mix disclosure in Oregon as well. And, we purchase RECs separately for separate purposes, unbundled RECs, not necessarily for compliance. And I can tell you that, it would not go over well in terms of our fuel mix disclosure if we started saying that, the source of the fuel is now renewable because we bought those unbundled RECs. So I think there's some tension between sort of the regulatory requirements that we're talking about now and kind of the marketing rules, and we're constantly trying to balance those things.
This is Johnny, and I just wanted to weigh in that I understand what people are saying, but I think the real goal is to make sure that nothing's double counted. And some of the suggestions I'm hearing seem to lead to the possibility that power could be double counted, whether through the REC or the power. So that would be a guiding principle that I'm looking for throughout this conversation.
And I'd like to steer the conversation back to our implementation of current practice and the work that Greg is doing to to get the 2015 fuel mix disclosure out and starting the 2016 process. The ideas that have been discussed so far about how we might do things better in the future are definitely on the table, and we intend to work on those over the remainder of this year and come back to that a little bit later in this meeting.
Thank you. So I'll just say that.
Hey, Glenn, this is Todd Jones at CRS. I just want to make sure that we're going to be getting back to that rec conversation. We have a lot to say on that as well, and I know that's a part of the agenda later on. So I just want to make sure we have time for that.
All right, thanks, Todd.
Yeah, so I have striven to recreate fuel mix on our new software platform, mimicking the previous software, all the policy assumptions, so warts and all, but just trying to continue it on a new, more versatile software platform. So anyway, I will move on to my next slide. So you all received an updated report last week. I had one comment. I don't see any comments by Monday morning. I'm just going to start working on the 2015 detailed report. Actually, I already have. I'm building up the spreadsheets and the charts. I started working on the 2015 emissions table, where our software is still not functioning as it should, so I have to do a little external calculations for that. That'll take a little while.
Greg, can I ask, what is the emissions table? What's the connection between that and the emissions report?
That, again, this is just continuing the tradition of 7 or 8 years, so I'm just mimicking that. So there's an emissions table in fuel mix going back probably to 2007.
So when utilities get their fuel mix reports, they get an emissions mix?
No, there's a state fuel
just
mix.
For your data purposes.
There's a state fuel mix and a state emissions table.
Okay, but they're really different purposes. I mean, one
Yeah,
is not getting reported by you.
I'm assuming that.
Okay.
So anyway, I have several more weeks of work to do, but I think I see the end of the line for 2015 fuel mix, and I'm proposing that we start the 2016 fuel mix process in a couple months.
Can I ask about the timing? Like, isn't, and again, I'm not the one doing the report, and, we have requirements of when we're supposed to be posting it, but what's the May 1st in the statute? Aren't we supposed to be getting some information by May 1st to be able to?
Yeah.
So how does that work?
Well, it's been late several years in a row, so this is reality. And we're going to talk about this in the legislative part. We'll touch on that.
Who are you not getting info? I mean, is like Seattle City Light, or are we not giving you information in a timely manner so that May 1st is not doable? I'm just trying to think of like the mechanics.
Well, for this May 1st, we haven't opened the portal because we're still working on the current software and the current fuel mix. So we have not requested 2016 data from utilities.
Okay,
Okay, so the last bit of what I want to talk about is change the net system mix calculation. We've gone over this at some of the previous meetings. a early contact we made with the Idaho and Montana energy offices. And, oh no, zeroing out again.
You wanted to make sure we covered that.
We've kind of covered it, so there's really not much more to say. I should perhaps delete that bullet. Okay, so at the past 3 or 4 meetings, we've talked about claims that we know of from PacifiCorp, Avista, Idaho, and BPA. And I've shown you what those, if those claims are drawn out of the Northwest Power Pool, what it does to the remaining net system mix. So this simple little pie chart shows you what happens. The net system mix goes from maybe a little over 55% of the Northwest Power Pool to about 23%. So it's a big change. So if you add these 3 entities, which are fairly well-known claims on generating resources, you end up with a much smaller slice of the pie, which we feel is a truer representation of what the net system mix is. So there it is in some numbers. This is an earlier table, but you can see the 175 million megawatt hours it's cut down a little bit more than in half to about 85 million megawatt hours. And you'll note the zeroing out down at the bottom. So, going into this...
Greg, could you math on how you take the design generation from the VistaCore pack and non-bill out? I mean, do you take it out based on load? Do you take it out based on gross output of facilities owned by those companies? How do you do that?
Well, for Vista, we have 60%, maybe a little more of the load is in Washington. They declare the resources. The Idaho portion, I'm assuming, is drawing in the resources.
So you don't go to all their generators and just take the generators they own off the map?
No.
Okay.
No. So
you base it on load?
I probably, yeah.
Okay, that's good. I get it.
Yeah. So going into this process, this update of fuel mix legislation, we are proposing removing the claims for these 3 entities from the Northwest Power Pool generation. And then we've made, like as I mentioned before, we made an initial contact with Montana and Idaho energy offices. Our assistant director, my supervisor did. So I will be having discussions with them to see if I can gather any claims data from those energy offices. And that would further reduce that pie that's shown in the pie chart earlier.
So it's additive to what you've done over
Yeah, I think so. I think that reduce that 85 million more. So I think we can talk about next steps, Glenn.
Yeah, great.
One more question. So when are you planning 16 fuel mix?
It might be the next cycle, but I can certainly produce mirror copies of 2014, 15, and 16 that have this Pacific Core, Vista, and DPA claims drawn out.
And is there some requirement before you change it, or what?
Well, we're going to talk about the Phoenix legislation, so I think it fits into that definition.
But it's also a possibility under existing law to remove those right there. I mean,
yeah, I don't think anything constrains it. It's just a matter of our discussions in the next few months would constrain us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So in terms of doing better in the future, I first would like to make sure that everybody knows that we would love to see a better way of doing the fuel mix calculation. Sometimes it's hard for me to believe that we aren't any better at doing this than we were 17 years ago when the statute was created. It feels like a clunky system to us. We hear lots of negative comments about both the work that goes into it on the part of utilities and the quality of the outcome. So if there's a slick way of doing this that's completely different, we're open to that possibility. So think about creative new ways of doing it. If you think the way somebody does it somewhere else would be a great thing to apply here. If you know about a data system that tracks resources on a much more timely basis than these annual reports, and you think we should rely on that, let us hear about it. We'd love to have something better than what we do now. Having said that, we almost certainly, if we come up with something really better and cooler, it wouldn't fit with the law we have now. But even if we had the same basic sources of information that we do now, we believe that the law is not working today. It needs to be updated. We've worked within the agency to get buy-off on us doing a stakeholder process to develop agency request legislation, and that means that we're ready to with having those discussions with stakeholders. We've laid out the way we see the issues, 7 points that are on the second page of the scoping document that we distributed. If anybody didn't pick that up on the credenza, we've still got copies available. So that's kind of the starting point for the things that we feel like need to be resolved for new legislation. We'd welcome your input either on those specific points as we go along, but then also if you think there's something that needs to be addressed in the legislation, the list is open for further items as well.
So I had a couple of questions on that list. So my first question was really about the first point, the consumer protection measure and deceptive practices. So as I understand it, this this report was put into law because there was a likelihood at the time that there was going to be deregulation and consumers would be able to pick what utility they would get their electricity from. And that didn't happen. So if you live in Seattle City Light service territory, you're Seattle City Light. If you move across to Bellevue, you're Puget Sound. You don't get a choice. So I'm not really clear about this, what the consumer protection is that you're trying to address. I understand the deceptive practices, going back to what Johnny's point is that you're not having double counting, but this is really just an informational report. So what consumer protection measures are you trying to address in here? I'm just trying to make sure that we're not creating problems that don't exist. I mean, what consumer protection are you trying to address?
I think it would be that if consumers had misleading information about the components of the product that they're purchasing, that would be a harm to consumers, for them to not get accurate information about the nature of the product. So I think that one kind of fundamental premise is that consumers have a right to this information about where their power comes from. And then the second point would be that the information that they receive is accurate.
Well, I thought at the last meeting we all kind of agreed that it wasn't totally accurate.
Yeah, and
I mean, so I guess I'm just, I mean, it's a close guess, but you can't say it's accurate.
Well, more accurate than not knowing anything. This is Johnny, and I just wanted to underline what Glenn said. I think that's where our Northwest Energy Coalition has operated from, is that the consumer has a right to know where the power they're using comes from and to have as good amount of information as possible. And obviously it's not perfect yet, but it will never, at this point, it won't be perfect, but it's better than not knowing at all.
well, and let's clarify though, having accurate information, misleading people with bad information is one thing. That is not under the definition of consumer protections. That is not a harm. You have not, in other words, if a co-op says, okay, we've got this much renewables in our portfolio, and it's found out that maybe you didn't have quite that much in there or something like that, you have not harmed the consumer any, because the consumer is going to be using that power from the co-op anyway. It's not like they have been harmed in the definition of consumer protection statutes. So I understand deceptive practices is one thing, but consumer protection is a whole different level and opens up a significant liability for companies who are covered by consumer protection laws in the state of Washington. So I think that needs to be seriously reconsidered, because there is no, just because wrong information is out there does not constitute consumer protection. That's deceptive practices, totally separate statute in Washington State.
Can I ask a question then? This is Johnny again. It sounds to me like you're raising a concern that the way this sentence is written, it implies that there's going to be some very technical consumer protection issues for some of your clients, but you don't have a problem with having and requiring accurate information to be provided to customers. Is that correct?
Well, our members, our co-op members demand accurate information. That's what's frustrating them about this current report, is the co-op management has to say, this is the report we're required to give you, but it's not accurate.
And Johnny, I would say that was my red flag, was reading this consumer protection, where really the purpose of this is to inform our customers about the resources we use to serve their load, but we can't say that it's fully accurate. And I do believe that you should have the mechanics of the report so that you're not, doing the double counting and you're not having it's not deceptive, but it's like the ballpark. There's going to be a difference between Seattle City Light saying that we're 95% hydro, but really we're only 20% hydro. You want to make sure that you can't be having a bald-faced lie.
Right.
But I think that consumer protection, and I don't believe in reading the statute that there are consumer protection issues brought up. And certainly as a utility, there are certain consumer protection issues that we have to abide by.
Consumer protection and deceptive practices are two separate things. Now, there are consumer protections that are hinged on deceptive practices, but it's not the same in the statute. So you've got to be very careful about using something like consumer protections.
So it's great to hear this level of interest in this sort of fundamental ground zero issue within the fuel mix disclosures. Why are we doing this at all? And so I look forward to continuing the conversation on this. We do, I think, agree on the idea that as a disclosure mechanism, we don't expect the level of accuracy that you might require if the purpose was something other than consumer disclosure and consumer protection. We don't really want to have this program used as the basis for taxation, for instance. And we wouldn't want to see utilities in some way penalized for small variations in what they disclose. And I'm not aware of any disclosure program anywhere that does hold utilities to the level of rigor that one might theoretically go to if you knew everything about all power transactions that were happening. This is meant to be a general source of information for consumers, and that's what we hope we end up with.
So can I, sorry, Joel Meyer from Mason PUD3 here. There are two things that I'm kind of curious about. The first one being that this is a quantitative report and not a qualitative report. These are just numbers so our customers know from what sources, as Ken was pointing out, our electricity comes from. But did I hear you say correctly that you would not want to see this report used as a basis of taxation? Because that seems to be the intent of some legislators.
That's, our view, and, other people may have a different view, but we don't think that this is a useful way to get at a tax basis. We think this the right thing. The reason why this is being done is to inform customers, and almost everything about the system would need to be beefed up if it were going to become a tax collection process.
On that, I would wonder why you are collecting or trying to collect emission data, which is not part of the report. It seems like it just makes it more complicated, and it's already complicated enough without trying to incorporate the emissions. If your intent is to ask the legislature to have emissions part of this report, then we should have that discussion. And I actually have talked to my folks about, we should really look internally as if someone said, hey, Seattle City Light, how would you count emissions? Like, let's have that conversation, you know, but your number 3 is contradicting what you're saying right now. I mean, and I would argue that having the emissions is making it more complicated. But so if you're not required to do the emissions, that is not to say we don't deal with the recs, how those are allocated, and how that is reflected in the report. I'm just saying that adding that extra layer is adding an extra layer, so it's making it more complicated.
Are you saying it's making the report more complicated, or your reporting?
Well, you know, for Seattle City Light, we track all of our emissions, you know, to demonstrate that we're carbon neutral. So we do a lot more carbon counting than what is done in this report. But I would argue that you know, again, if the report is about what your resources are, you need to be reporting the resources. If you actually want us to be counting what the emissions are, I think that's adding an extra layer of complication for both the utility and for you.
And I guess, I don't know, maybe you haven't, maybe this is such in the idea stage that we aren't ready to talk about specifics, but for instance, you know, the full requirements customer co-op. There's an emissions report. Is that because you guys look at what you're assuming we're getting from the net system, and then from there you just assume what emissions are included in the assumption? So it's not an accurate report, and when my co-op members look at it and go, oh my God, you guys have all these emissions, and the co-op goes, well, actually we don't, because we have no idea what our emissions are. It's whatever power BPA sends us. So you're just guessing through there to come up with an emissions report, right? Or have you gotten that far?
I would certainly hope that we don't end up with a process where we're guessing. We do hope that we can collect enough information to be able to allow utilities to provide reasonable reports, you know, reasonably founded reports of sources of their electricity and the emissions that come with them. And we think that one reason why customers are interested in this information is because they're interested in their own, the emissions that come with the consumption decisions that they make. And so one possibility would be to do the math themselves, but another possibility would be to present to them information that has both the sources and the emissions from those sources in the report. And we see that in other states. It's not a novel idea.
But those would be known sources then.
It certainly could be known. There's an open question here of what we should do with unspecified sources. We certainly want to try to squeeze those down, but we're not fixed on the current practice of allocating the unspecified back to individual sources. We've seen in other states that some people just let it go on the report as unspecified. So that's a possibility that's worth discussing.
So given the state that the fuel mix isn't, you know, the goal isn't to have it be something that taxation is based off of, I would say that incorporating emissions data or a carbon accounting methodology into the fuel mix probably isn't the right step at this point, and rather a separate carbon accounting methodology should probably be developed that may take care of taxation purposes and then also provide customers the information that they would need, rather than try and put it with the fuel mix right now at this point. So that's what I would advocate for.
This is Johnny. Could I ask a clarifying question, Glenn?
Sure.
So when you were talking about incorporating emissions, are you talking only about carbon or about other emissions that, say, other fuel sources, you know, say a coal fuel source might emit? Because when I first read this, I thought it was actually a way of kind of clarifying between 4B and C, but I could be wrong. I just need that clarification.
We haven't talked about what emissions might be disclosed.
Maybe I toss something. This is David Nightingale with the UTC, and just for people that don't already know, this past year was the first year that required our electric utilities to provide a report to us on energy intensity as well as emissions intensity. And the piece that we were actually relying on fuel mix report is the unknown sources or to fill in that gap of stuff that people are doing through a broker or something like that, and they really honestly don't know. Then they just use the emissions average from the fuel mix report. So and this is just for, again, the level Glenn's talking about, for taxation or engineering level stuff is at a much deeper fine-tuned level than what we feel we need as well, because we're looking at 10-year trends on energy usage by residential or commercial customers. So, getting it to the nearest, half a megawatt per, generating unit, is beyond what we need. We want to look at the trends. But there is a utility, currently we're relying explicitly on the fuel mix report for the emissions from those unknown sources. So there's actually a layering upon this, what already exists that we use, and we'd have to find something else then to substitute for that if it wasn't available through this reporting mechanism.
Yeah, the Department of Ecology is using the emissions fuel mix as well too.
So I guess a clarifying question. So number 3 is incorporating emissions data. So is that something beyond what's being done currently? Or is that just kind of continuing the status quo of what emissions reporting you're doing?
Incorporating it into the statute. I think people have correctly observed that the existing statute doesn't include emissions data. So that's what we mean by incorporating.
We've been doing it for years. There's a policy basis.
Right.
Yeah.
Are you going to go through these at some point? Like, what does strengthening the obligation mean? Changing the formats? What outdated administrative provisions do you want to get rid of? Who are the suppliers that you want to add that aren't currently classified? I mean, are you going to at some point go through all those, or?
Well, I mean, and it's going to be for some combination of asking stakeholders for input on those points and answering questions that stakeholders have about the direction that we think we want to go. So, at this point, we're just kind of trying to scope out a set of issues that we think we need to resolve in order to bring legislation to a concrete piece of legislation forward. And these are all things that I think we talked about at one point or another along the way. Maybe the formatting, I don't recall talking about that at a meeting, but we'd like to see some of the proposals in California to do a power disclosure report, the formatting on that. Again, I think the current statute isn't wouldn't be quite the format that we think would be most helpful to customers, but we don't have a specific alternative in mind. And, some of the people who are on the front lines of explaining things to customers would be a good source of information for us.
So is there some impetus, I mean, somebody driving, like the governor or somebody like that, the desire to change this? And let me put that a little bit in context because this year we faced several bills passed, and you said you don't want this to be the basis for a carbon. Yet over the next several months, we would be devoting a bunch of resources to updating or make better the fuel mix calculation, and then we'll move into next year with potentially more carbon tax bills. So is it the right time to dedicate resources to something that might require a quick shift in focus in next year's session? So that's why I was asking, what's driving the desire of Commerce to do this?
Well, our desire to change it is because we think it's a broken. The many observations that people have made about how the law does this, does that, it's wrong on this point, on that point. A couple of those are kind of crazy, but most of them are very solid criticisms of the current law. And it's not like we're the first ones to propose changing the law. I mean, we've seen bills in earlier sessions that do that, and we're ready to get with it. We think it needs to be fixed.
Timing, what kind of timing are you looking at? If this document you're talking about a draft in May, are you going to put a draft out and then convene a stakeholder group? Thinking about maybe talking with stakeholders about the 7 principles here a little bit more before you put a draft together, or how do you envision the process?
Well, I thought about that some and am open to further suggestions on that point. It did seem like that if we put some sort of straw proposal forward, it's probably going to have some holes in it, that we're, on some points we may say, well, you could do this, we could do that. But at least it would be kind of a concrete outline that then stakeholders could react to and suggest improvements to. That's our thought. Does that seem like a good way to do that? Or?
Well, I think it would be more useful to have a little bit more time to consider these subpoints, and that before you put much energy into drafting something to lose the foundation you really want to build a house on.
Well, that's good advice.
Both of us, I was wondering if, maybe I know we've had stakeholder meetings and we've heard concerns from the utilities, but I'm just wondering, has the question been specifically asked, what would you like to see in request legislation from Commerce? And I mean, maybe you have and these 7 points reflect that, but I'm just not sure if that exact question had been asked, what would we want to see in that?
Well, would it, to invite some written comments from stakeholders, would that be a better first step than us putting out a straw proposal? Any thoughts on that?
I think it would be.
Yeah, I think it would be helpful if we kind of frame them based on these 7 points, either, kind of adding some more meat to it. Because I would think that there might be some general agreement on some of the mechanics issues of how it's actually like dates and time frames and kind of that sort of stuff that might be a little bit easier to at least agree on and move away from those and then deal with the ones that are a little bit more substantive. But from our perspective, we're going to do it. Let's just try to make it so that it works. And as you were pointing out, it has been a struggle for you guys to make it work. So part of it is getting some information about like, well, what would make it work from you, on the receiving end of having to do the report, and then from the utility, how does it work for us to be able to, like, do we think this is the right information? Is it,
Well,
is it
from the phone here, I'm sorry, Rose, didn't know you were done.
I'm done.
Okay, from our perspective, it's fine. I think people could send in comments, but we always go back to the discussion of, well, until you have actual language to look at and talk about, we're not going to get very far. So I personally would welcome seeing a draft in May or whenever you can get it out, because that's a good starting point for discussion, and we can clarify what we all mean by whether it's consumer protection or information or strategies or new sources, and that I think would be fine.
Question on the phone.
Go ahead, Zach.
Hey, Glenn. On number 4, I don't want to get into the weeds, but you have, incorporate how the industry is using RECs. Have you thought about maybe incorporating how the industry is using specified source purchases and sales as well? So that would be for when you buy sources specifically from for example, a hydro producer, there's not necessarily a REC associated with it, but I should be able to claim that it's a hydro purchase.
Yeah, and you can, and we certainly wouldn't want to change that. I see that coming in more on that item number 2, where seeing what we could do to have more of the transactions, identify the sources so that we have fewer unspecified sources to argue about later.
So that was a really useful clarification, and honestly, I didn't read it from this. So I guess just based on that sentence, I think there's merit to what Dave is asking for, because that is a comment on changing market purchase practices, and it's just gutturally just strikes me as so far beyond fuel mix disclosure. Like, that's a whole nother world. So maybe there is more value in having you guys spend some time describing a little more detail, a little more, what are the 7? Some of them are more obvious than others. And I think there's probably, I can imagine a number of people here and on the call could support making some improvements to this pretty old law that's got some limitations and kinks in it. But this is some pretty sweeping stuff, possibly, that you're looking at. And I understand Ian's point about, well, we're looking at other models for dealing with carbon oils, and this has some limitations on its ability, even though it might be kinder in a way to the electricity industry. The net system mix versus tax for every megawatt of unspecified power. But you do have a lot going on here. I'm picking up on, and it might merit another conversation.
So I'll throw in, I don't know if this is like number 8 or if it's embedded in here, but Seattle City Light and I know Puget Sound Energy are both entering, and Pacific Core is full member with the Western EIM. And given the fact that, hindsight is this legislation was passed prior to RECs, and when RECs came about, it kind of confused things. So I think we need to be mindful that the EIM is going to have, I would assume, will have some impact on this, and we should be mindful for the utilities that are participating in the EIM what that is going to mean. So I think we need to be thinking about that. Again, not every utility is going to join, but those of us who are going to be in, obviously we're going to have to think about that when you're writing the legislation, but I think that all of us need to be mindful that the EIM is going to have an impact on that.
Yeah, and I think that's an excellent point. I would even expand it a little bit to say that one of the outdated aspects of the current law is the requirement to look at the Northwest Power Pool. And with our transactions with California. We're missing a lot there. Melissa brought that up earlier about specified sources being exported, and we're not capturing that. Things that happen in the EIM are important that those be accounted for to the extent that it's possible. So yeah, that's a good issue to add.
So I guess maybe is it the Northwest Power Pool, or is it something else, or how do we capture it that the market's different?
Mm-hmm.
This is Joel Meyer at Mason PUD3 again. This is just a question in terms of process of the actual creation of the report and not leading up to possible revisions in it. Because all of us public agencies are auditable on the management of the release to our customers, is there a hope to have a more reliable date of issuance on this report with the development of the new software and the calculations?
There is that hope, Joel.
Yeah.
It's like opening day. There's always hope.
Yeah. But, one of the things in the list was about dates, and so quite seriously, we do want to look at a realistic set of deadlines that, so that we can do better than we have in the past.
Yeah, and this would be really helpful because this way we don't have to explain to the auditor why they're looking at the version they're looking at. They know that when they come in and they take a look at our disclosures, they are the most current, and they just go from there. So that would be really helpful and I know you guys are striving for that, and if you can do it, my hat's off to you.
Okay. Hey, Todd Jones.
Yes.
Yeah,
thanks.
Ask for a little bit.
So
talk about.
Are we now back to talking about the rec issue?
Well, I don't think we've got the time today to, fully go through that. But you did ask for a little bit of time, and so, first, let me say that I distributed or left out for you this FTC letter, which I also didn't intend to discuss in depth. But people have asked before about where we get off with and what we do about on the rec to make the claim. And so I wanted to share that with you as an example of why we think what we do about that. And to say that we're willing to discuss that further with you whenever you want to do that. And then now I think maybe Todd can just provide a little bit of information on their view of how RECs should be handled.
Thank you. Yeah, so with respect to whether fuel mix disclosure should reflect what is delivered to customers or what is being generated, you heard somebody say, if it's generated, it gets used somewhere. If customers are getting disclosure, we think they are assuming that this is what is being delivered. This is the fuel mix that they can claim to be receiving. So RECs are required for delivery claims. You need a contractual instrument for renewable energy, that's the REC, to determine who gets what. That's the only way to do it. So if disclosure is intended to tell customers what is being delivered to them and what they can claim to be consuming, then RECs must be retired for specified renewable energy to be reported to substantiate that retail product claim and in order to prevent double counting. If disclosure is intended to show just what's being generated,
hang on
then you...
Todd?
Sure.
I know who you are, but it turns out not everybody here does. So can you introduce yourself and then...
Sure. I'm Todd Jones. I'm with the Center for Resource Solutions. We're a a nonprofit, and we, our mission is to advance policies and markets for sustainable energy development. We've been around since 1997. Among other things, we run the Greenie programs, which some of you may be familiar with. Greenie Energy is the leading voluntary, or the leading certification, standard certification for renewable energy in the voluntary market in the U.S. We certify a majority of the U.S. voluntary renewable energy market. I lead our policy work, which is mostly aimed at state-level renewable energy policy. We're really only able to sort of get engaged where there's a clear double counting or consumer protection issue, which means that we usually engage around things like power source disclosure, fuel mix disclosure, any potential interactions between RPS, other renewable energy compliance markets, and the voluntary market or voluntary claims and benefits. So that's who I am.
Thank you.
Sure. So I was just saying, if disclosure is intended to show just what's being generated, then I think you have to be very, very clear to customers that this disclosure does not necessarily represent what they can claim to be receiving, just what's being generated. And I think customers may nevertheless assume that disclosure is saying this is the fuel mix or the attributes that you're receiving. And we heard somebody say earlier that customers don't care about attributes, they just care about where their fuel comes from. But fuel type is an attribute of generation. Fuel type's not physically delivered. So again, if disclosure is intended to report fuel types being delivered to customers, and we think this is what they care about, so they do care about attributes. They may not know what RECs are, but they do care about the attributes of their power, not just what's being generated. Then ownership of the attributes determines who gets to claim what fuel. So you need that information in order to disclose that renewable energy is being delivered to the customer that's receiving the disclosure. So that means that power without RECs should be reported as null power for delivery claims. And we have a different understanding of what's being proposed in California than what Pacific Corp reported earlier with respect to what they were calling separate reporting of RECs. So AB 1110 just requires separate disclosure of the proportion of the renewable energy delivered that was procured using unbundled RECs. So that's different than having a separate report of renewable energy delivered that is based on RECs and another one that's based on just power purchases. So California is just disclosing the proportion that was procured unbundled, since this has been deemed to be important for customers to know. And we and others are still advocating that RECs be required for all renewable energy that is reported as delivered. We have, with respect to the reporting timeline differences between fuel mix disclosure and RPS and other renewable energy programs, we heard somebody say that we wouldn't have a mismatch of years based on when you use the RECs if RECs weren't involved in fuel mix disclosure. So we have suggested solutions to this in California, and this should not prevent a requirement that RECs be retired for all specified renewable energy reported in fuel mix disclosure. So to comply with that requirement, reporting entities will first of all always have the option to simply make annual retirements of RECs or retirements of RECs in time for fuel mix disclosure. But moving forward, with that approach, you can provide the suppliers or the reporting entities with the option to true up, older labels, older disclosure based on retirements of RECs that are held over from previous years, provided that they disclose on the label that the renewable energy number could change, and that really should be only permitted for the RPS component of the power content label, not all renewable energy. So that truing up is not ideal, and it in fact causes problems for Greenie as well. But if it's the only way to provide fuel mix disclosure to customers that reflects what's being delivered, if obligated parties under the RPS are not, committing to delivering RPS renewables until after fuel mix disclosure is required, then so be it. And finally, with respect to what goes into the residual mix, or I guess what you call net system mix, from our perspective, any specified contracts for renewable energy should not be included in the residual mix. So in particular, any renewable energy purchases that are intended for the RPS, whether or not the RECs are retired, should be excluded from the residual mix. So renewable energy, for which the RECs have been sold or held or otherwise not retired, so null power in that reporting year, is not included in the residual mix calculations. And that effectively means that the emissions attributes of that power aren't really included anywhere in emissions disclosure. So not reported as specified renewable energy or included in the residual mix if the RECs aren't retired. If a significant amount of RECs are being held or banked, that may result in a residual mix that, in combination with emissions from other generation, are slightly dirtier than the actual grid. But that just reflects the fact that zero emissions attributes are being held and not delivered. So we think reporting entities just need to identify all renewable energy purchases that they made that are intended for the RPS. Those are really the only purchases for which they should be holding and not retiring RECs, even if they haven't retired the RECs yet. So I know we're at time here, and I have a bunch more to say about unspecified mix and your current practices about making unspecified specified, and also emissions disclosure, but I think I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to provide more information in written form or in other forms.
Okay, thanks, Todd. We'll send out to the stakeholder list your contact information, and if anybody wants to follow up with you, they can do it that way.
One question. I'm wondering if you do solicit comments from folks, that would be something that then you could make available to everybody so we kind of understand, where everybody's at. I think that would be helpful.
Okay, so I think maybe thing for us to do would be I'm going to take our 7 points and probably make them into 8, and maybe expand on them a little bit without writing a new dissertation, and then send that out to people and give them a few weeks to comment on it before we do any straw proposal of our own. So I'm going to try to be a little more clear about these concepts, and then we're going to hold off on even a straw proposal until you've had a chance to offer your own thoughts on these. That sound okay?
Yep.
That would be helpful.
So we'll look for a timeline that will probably have your comments coming back by the end of May. Okay. With that.
This is Mary at PacifiCorp. I'm sorry to add this one last comment. I just wanted to clarify. I was saying what PacifiCorp is proposing in California, not what California is currently proposing. I just wanted to be clear about that. Maybe I wasn't clear about that before.
I got that, Mary, and I remember seeing your proposal, so I know just what you're talking about.
Yeah.
All right. Anything else? May we go to lunch?
Yeah.
All right, we're adjourned. Thank you all for coming. I really do appreciate it.
Yeah.
I don't ever use